Hello, fellow Gators. Thank you so much for joining me today for this very special podcast in which we interview Professor Charles Egan from the Chinese department here at San Francisco State University. My name is Ying Wencie Hoang, and I work as one of the publicity assistants with the College of Liberal and Creative Arts to bring you this very special podcast today. In this conversation, we will be going through some photographs pictured in Professor Egan's book, as well as talking about Angel Island, the people who experienced Angel Island, as well as immigration and Professor Charles Egan's experience. So without further ado, here is Professor Egan and his journey in creating Voices of Angel Island.
My field is classical Chinese poetry. That's what I was trained in. And my previous publications have primarily been in that, with some merging into Buddhism and art history. I've been working on this book for, almost 15 years, I think. This Angel Island project came up simply because I lived in San Francisco, and I was asked to join a group that was doing a reevaluation of the inscriptions at Angel Island. And so it became pretty much a consuming interest. Angel Island was almost torn down in the 70s. It was seen as just a decaying old government building. The state parks people who were in charge of Angel Island wanted to turn the whole place into a campground. One member of their staff, Alexander Weiss, who was also a student at San Francisco State, saw the Chinese writings on the wall and brought them to the attention of his professor, who then brought in the Chinese American community. And so it became sort of a community effort to save the building and to save the inscriptions. When they began to rebuild the building, this happened in the early 2000s. At the same time, they brought in a few of us to look at the walls again to see what else there was that hadn't been published before. What we found was that there were dozens more Chinese inscriptions and poems and other types of inscriptions that had not been included in the previous book. There are dozens and dozens of inscriptions in other languages: Japanese, Bengali, Spanish, Russian, Korean, really quite a huge number of different things. And those had never been studied. We did a preliminary report as a small group back in the early 2000s to try to assess what's on the walls, but it was quite preliminary. A lot of places we were just able to say Japanese inscription over here, Russian over here. Even though all four of us were Chinese studies people, at the time we were only able to fully decipher about a dozen of the new inscriptions, and otherwise we had bits and pieces of things. This site at Angel Island is very deteriorated. The building has now been renovated for safety, but the walls themselves they haven't touched, because the walls as they look now are pretty much the way the immigrants who went through there experienced them. Almost as soon as the building opened in 1910, the immigrants began writing on the walls. Authorities began painting the walls almost immediately. There are I think six or seven different layers of lead-based paint on everything there. The Chinese immigrants were rather resourceful. They then took to calligraphing inscriptions on the walls and then carving them in with a knife. Well, then the authorities would then fill the voids with putty and paint over them. The reason why it's so difficult to read the materials on the walls now, and partly why it's taken so much time for this project to be completed, is that you're staring through these layers of paint and you have to try to match those with Chinese characters. One metaphor for it would be like you're trying to read an inscription in the sand on the beach after a wave has washed over it. The inscriptions on the walls were very revealing and fascinating materials. The Chinese materials are poetry, some angry, some nostalgic, more political in nature, about the tragic history of China in the 19 teens and 1920s. Then there's things that are more miscellaneous, like political statements that are carved on the walls that date back to, the politics of those days. The inscriptions in other languages are often much less literary. There's a few poems in Japanese that are written on the walls here and there. The inscriptions that are not Chinese are much more mundane. Things like names and dates. I was here, essentially, right? And those are not maybe as interesting intrinsically, but they're much important historically, because in a lot of cases you can track down who those people were. I have these different chapters on the various groups that went through the island: Japanese, Koreans, Chinese. Then I have a chapter on Russians and Europeans and other groups. And finally, I have a chapter on the Angel Island inscriptions from World War II, because this site became part of Fort McDowell nearby, and it was used as a detention center for what they called enemy aliens in those days, which included Japanese Hawaiians who were rounded up after Pearl Harbor, and also for prisoners of war, Germans, Italians, and later Japanese. There's inscriptions by all of these different groups in there, and many of them can yield interesting research. The Japanese inscriptions, one of the earliest ones I found was by a boy named Masaru Miyamoto from 1912. Masaru and his wife, Kinio, were both held at Angel Island during immigration. Later on, their three sons all served in the U.S. military. They were solid American citizens, but they were from Hiroshima. So, quite ironically, the little village that they came from is outside of the city of Hiroshima, and so actually should have been safe from the atomic explosion, except that the local civil corps of this town had been ordered into the city center to do demolition work, and were right there at ground zero when the atomic bomb was dropped. More than 200 people from this one village were all killed. Masaru's wife, Kinio's father, had retired to Hiroshima, and he'd gone into the city to take some luggage to the train station, and he was immediately killed, in the atomic explosion. Masaru's younger sister, born in California, had moved back to Japan. She and her husband and their daughter were all killed in the atomic explosion. Their oldest son in the military was posted to Japan as a translator for the occupation. He never talked about it much later to the family, but he visited Hiroshima, after the bomb was dropped, and then went to see the family and shared his rations with them. These historical events had such a huge effect on every member of this family in ways that are ironic and also really very revealing of the times. I was able to track his story all the way down to his grandchildren, and met with them when they came out to Angel Island to see the old man's inscription on the walls. It was emblematic of many of the historical changes of the 20th century. As Japanese immigrants faced a lot of bias, they were affected by various regulations, rules, laws that were established to minimize their social role in California. For example, the alien land laws, there were several versions of these dating back to the teens and 20s, did not allow anyone who was not buying or selling or bequeathing farmland right? And many of the Japanese immigrants who came were farmers. They were settling in the Central Valley. The combination of the alien land laws and then, of course, the internment that came in World War II wiped away much of the Japanese agricultural community and precipitated a move by Japanese Americans into the cities where they are today. Even as a child, one of my loves was archaeology and anthropology. And so as a graduate student, I did both Chinese poetry, but also Chinese art history. And I became very interested in calligraphy and decipherment of materials. So finding puzzles, this many puzzles all together in the walls of the Angel Island was just like gold mine to me. In the case of the Masaru Miyamoto or many of the other families, the inscription writers that I was able to identify, finding the passenger manifest was the sort of first step. You found when they got there and where they came from, and then you get all this various information. And then I went through a process of searching different public types of public documents to try to trace the histories of these people in America after they left Angel Island. It was actually quite rewarding to me when I'd write a letter, send it off, and they'd say they had no idea their grandfather was at Angel Island. So excited to learn, about their family history. There's so many things they don't know. The other is more literary. I do a lot of translation of poetry. The Chinese poems were particularly rewarding. First, you'd have to decipher them, but then to be able to put them into some kind of a meaningful and powerful translation in English was great. Other groups didn't write their poetry on the walls. Didn't mean they weren't writing poetry. I expanded the project from Angel Island to poetry by immigrants in the same period in ethnic newspapers. There were two competing daily Japanese newspapers in San Francisco in the period before World War II. Going through huge numbers of those microfilms, you found that they published poetry in them all the time. And sometimes they were writing about Angel Island. They're writing about picture brides, or they're writing about their first impressions of the San Francisco skyline, or their experiences as pioneering farmers in the Central Valley. Really a lot of personal impressions of California and America in those days. There was a very important Korean nationalist newspaper that published in the Bay Area before World War II. It had a great importance. It was a weekly, the Sinhan Minbo, or the New Korea. At the time, Japan had annexed Korea, and there was no press freedom there. So even though this was way over in California, this newspaper became a very important mouthpiece for Korean nationalist sentiments. A couple of which are exactly about Angel Island. Others are really about their status as refugees whose homeland was occupied. By having some Japanese poetry, Korean poetry, there's even a couple of Russian poems. I'm trying to give a balanced picture of the different groups and how their experiences were different, but at the same time, they're the same. Initial immigration inspections would be done on the docks. The Chinese exclusion laws were in effect during this entire period. The immigration service had a variety of different mechanisms that they could use to hold people or to suspect them. You could be held for not having enough money with you. They call that LPC, likely to become a public charge. Or you could be held for medical reasons. There were a host of so-called tropical diseases, which immigrants were supposed to be bringing into the United States, that you could be held for that and possibly deported. There were other regulations which targeted women. There was almost a level of enforcing morality in some immigration service regulations. Racial separation, ethnic separation was a given. There were big dormitories for Chinese, and there were separate dormitories for Europeans. There was an Asian dining room, and there was a European dining room. From beginning to end, you got a sense of how American society was working in them. The immigrants who were welcome in those days were Northern European Protestants. Quotas for those, ended up being larger than those for those from Russia, for example, or from Southern Europe. The way that they were discouraged was that the quota was set based on the number of people from that community in America at a certain time. But they backdated it by 30 years. They said they were using 1890 census numbers, right? So the quota for Russians, which would include Russian and Eastern European Jews, because most of Eastern Europe was under Russian control. The number of people from that area in 1890 was very small. So as a result, their quota was very small. Meanwhile, the quotas for people from Britain or from Germany were almost the same as they'd been before. Immigration law itself was modeled on social prejudices. The idea of the illegal immigrant really comes out of largely the Chinese American experience. The Chinese exclusion laws were the very first law that singled out a particular ethnic and racial group for regulation, right? The apparatus of the immigration service grew over time to the point where you have this massive operation now. There are hundreds of thousands of people whose job is to police the borders, or to detain people. That is a modern creation that doesn't go back to the 19th century. Things are more polarized now than any time in my life. Maybe it was just because things didn't show as much back when I was a kid. The arguments against immigration, a lot of the same arguments are being used today, but just the targets have changed. It's fear of the other, the fear that immigrants will take so-called American jobs. Those are all the same now. I think that even though this is a book about a particular historical period, it's quite topical. People taking sides on this, and a lot of people in this country, just their first reaction is, well, let's keep America for the American. When in fact, we've always had immigrants. The country is made up of immigrants. Everybody here is an immigrant, except for the Native Americans. The concept of the illegal immigrant came after the Civil War. Once you had this idea of who is a citizen, then you also then naturally create the idea of the non-citizen. You didn't have to get a visa to come to this country before 1924. A lot of our common understandings about legal versus illegal immigration, it seems to me, misses a lot of the point. This is the first big publication I've had on California history. I'm not a historian who's writing about these big events in a sense. What I'm doing with this particular project is to try to use some of that historical context to order a book and then present the voices of the individuals who went through the system.
Thank you so much, fellow Gators, for tuning in on today's podcast featuring Professor Charles Egan. It was a lovely experience, and we are very happy that we had the opportunity to work with him. If you would like further information as to how to purchase Voices of Angel Island, we have included that information in the description of this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, fellow Gators, and we will see you next time.